April 25th, 1973. Enfield, Illinois. Nestled in the border of America's heartland and in the southeastern tip of Illinois resides the very small village of Enfield, perhaps the prototypical example of small-town America. Few main roads stretch between house to house, and woods, forests, and farmland dominate the area around Enfield. Perhaps Enfield is so quaint and so quiet, the only thing Enfield has going for it is that it produced a pitcher for the Boston Red Sox in 1924 named Lefty Jamerson, who pitched one inning and never did again. If anything, kind of indicative of what you would think of Enfield if you happen to pass through it on a cross-country road trip. Just a little footnote in rural America. However, Enfield would become an epicenter for a monster story that would take the local community by storm. And while this small little town never truly had anything to show for it, it suddenly would. And on one night in April in 1973, that would all change. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we examine and investigate a cryptid story that gripped the heartbeat of this small Illinois town. Could it be possible that the Enfield Monster could have truly been a creature or monster from some unknown planet? Could it have been simply a misidentified animal? Or maybe simply a case of mass hysteria? Today on the show, we explore the story and encounters of the Enfield Monster. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and if you happen to be checking out this show on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out within the algorithm, and I greatly appreciate it. If you happen to be checking out this show on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. And again, I greatly appreciate it. I appreciate all the support and love that everybody has shown me. And while you're at it, while you're on YouTube and Spotify, feel free to also follow me on my other social medias. Feel free to follow me on Instagram at the same handle, Unblurring the Unknown, and on TikTok at Unblurring the Unknown as well. Do follow up with all things this show there. Now, today on the show, we are back within the realm of cryptids, or as I like to think of them, my bread and butter. I love a good cryptid story, and while the Enfield Monster might seem like a little footnote in the overall cryptid dictionary, he, she, or it is more than worthy of their own episode, and combined with the multiple sightings and description of this monster alone, it certainly lives up to its moniker. Now, I hope you all liked the intro into today's episode, and like I mentioned, Enfield is small-time America, and reminds me a lot of the local towns where I used to grow up in, where there really wasn't anything going on, and the most exciting thing that you could go or do growing up was maybe going to a chain restaurant or doing dumb stuff in parking lots. Enfield strikes me as that type of town. Maybe it isn't, but considering I have personally lived in small-town America, I think I can relate to a certain degree. Now, we always try to find, of course, small-town America, you always try to find one popular thing that you were kind of proud of it. So when I found out that Enfield had a one-time baseball player who pitched for one inning and had a name like Lefty Jamerson, perhaps one of the best old-timey baseball names that I have personally ever heard, I just had to include it in the intro for today's episode. Even though it has absolutely no relevance to today's story or anything that has to do with the Enfield Monster, I just thought it was really funny and I wanted to include it. But enough backstory about old-timey baseball players in small-town America. Let's talk about how today's episode is going to work. Now, again, we're going to touch briefly about Enfield, Illinois, and perhaps what it was like to live there during this time period, and then go into the sightings of the Enfield Monster and the subsequent investigations and the fallout of these sightings and everything that we now associate with these sightings. And now that it has been over 40 years since they originally happened, we kind of circle back and we talk about the theories of what we still have in terms of this creature. So without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. Now, like I mentioned at the very top, Enfield, Illinois is very, very, very small, with a population of only in the hundreds. You're talking very, very small. Even smaller than, again, some of the towns that I grew up in. So I can only imagine, kind of the overall vibe of this town and everybody kind of having that knowledge of everybody knowing each other, everybody feeling like they're neighbors to one another, especially in the 1970s. I mean, the current population is still only in the hundreds. So I have to imagine, you're living in an area where everybody knows each other. It's very spread out. You have a lot of farmland, a lot of forested area. You have a lot of train tracks that go through this area. So it's a very remote area, kind of right in the border of kind of America's heartland as you're starting to enter kind of the Midwest and things like that. It's kind of right next to the border of, I believe, Kentucky, very close to it, if I'm not mistaken. My geography is eluding me right now as I'm recording this. But again, very, very small area, very quaint, very rural, extremely rural, and you have that overarching theme of everybody kind of knowing each other, and of course, that kind of feeds into this story as we get deeper into it, of everybody knowing each other and everybody kind of spreading stories amongst the population, how easy it is to kind of tell a story and how quickly that story can spread within a very local, rural community and how that just kind of grips the community as a whole. And like I said, that's going to play a big role in the story moving forward. Now, our story about the Enfield Monster begins on April 25th, 1973, at the house and property of Henry McDaniel. At around 10 p.m. that night, Henry was at his home in Enfield with his wife and 2 children. While at home that night, Henry would hear a strange scratching noise at the front door of his home. Of course, this would strike Henry as very odd. Who would be at his door at 10 p.m., and better yet, what would be scratching at the door at 10 p.m.? Thinking that this could be a stray animal or something like that was trying to get into his house, Henry decided to open up his door and see what was out there. Now, when Henry opened up the door, he would come face to face with something that he could not explain. The animal in front of his home was not like anything Henry had ever seen before. Standing in front of Henry McDaniel would be a hideous-looking creature, almost alien in appearance. It was very small and stocky, having only 3 legs and 2 arms that seemed to come out from its chest / kind of in its breast area. It was 4.5 to 5 feet tall. It was gray in color and had large pink-colored eyes. Now, it would be reasonable to assume that Henry was absolutely shocked and bewildered when he saw this creature. His first instinct was, like any rational human being, to get a gun. Henry would instantly close the door in the face of this creature and go to a nearby closet and grab a flashlight and a .22 caliber pistol he had stashed in that closet. Henry would open the door back up to his front yard, and at the time, this creature had moved away from his home and was roughly about 12 feet away from the McDaniel home. Henry would aim his pistol and fire 4 shots at the creature. Henry stated later on that he felt very confident that he at least hit the creature once, as the creature would make a hiss-like noise that Henry would compare to that of a hiss of a wildcat or bobcat would make. Now, at this point, the creature would flee from the McDaniel property towards a nearby railroad embankment. The distance from where the creature was standing in the McDaniel yard to the embankment was roughly 50 to 75 feet. And according to Henry McDaniel, this creature would make a series of leaps and bounds when it fled, stating that this creature covered the distance between the yard to the embankment in just 3 large leaps, which again, we're talking 50 to 75 feet. If that is true, that is pretty impressive. Now, at this point, McDaniel would call the local police and tell them about what he encountered that evening and what this thing was, for lack of a better word, that he shot at on his property. Now, when the police arrived, unfortunately, the creature was gone and nowhere to be found. However, the police and Henry would discover a set of tracks near the soft dirt near his home that were resembling that of a dog's, but not fully like a dog's, because they had 6 toe pads on them. For context, dogs, when they leave a track behind, they would leave 4 to 5 pad impressions, 4 from the toes and maybe 1 from the main pad of the foot. So this is similar to that of a dog's, but a little bit different. Now, according to one source I saw, what made these tracks even more strange was that one of the tracks was smaller than the other, indicating that the animal was in fact 3-footed, like Henry McDaniel has claimed. So, for example, you have 2 larger footprints and then 1 smaller one, which kind of confirms, again, like I said, the idea that Henry saw this thing and said it had 3 legs, which is, of course, very, very strange, because what animal out there on Earth has 3 legs? And these footprints would seemingly confirm the idea that this being existed. It was present in some way, and it wasn't like Henry was hallucinating this thing. Now, while it was Henry McDaniel's sighting that popularized the story of the Enfield Monster, also sometimes referred to as the Enfield Horror, there was another sighting that took place right before Henry's that night of April 25th, 1973. A half hour earlier, at the home of the neighbors of Henry McDaniel, lived the Garretts. Greg Garrett, a 10-year-old boy, was playing in his backyard at around 9:30 p.m. that night, only a half hour before the McDaniel sighting. Now, while Greg Garrett was playing outside like many kids his age, he was getting ready to head in for the night when a sound coming from the dark nighttime air caught his attention. From the darkness, a strange creature emerged. Now, much like Henry McDaniel's sighting, Greg Garrett would describe the creature very similarly, if not exactly, how Henry saw it. Greg would describe it as gray in color, with reddish-colored eyes, only having 3 legs, and roughly 4 to 5 feet tall, and the front arms of the creature almost bending into hook-like claws in the front. The description was almost one and the same. Now, as this creature stepped out of the darkness in front of Greg Garrett, and this is kind of where the story gets a little bit wild, Greg would claim this creature would then attack him and stomp on his shoes and shred them to pieces, and Greg fought to try and get away from the clutches of this slimy gray monstrosity. Eventually, Greg Garrett was able to get loose from the monster that was attacking him and was able to flee back inside. Now, this story, as well as Henry McDaniel's, took the town by storm, and after all, I can see why. It is very frequently that I have seen small-town America gripped by stories of monsters and things of the like, and it is instant front-page news. The next morning, the story was exactly that, and Henry McDaniel's story was all over it. The Carmi Times, the local newspaper, ran the story of a monster attack in Enfield, and of course this was spread amongst the townsfolk by word of mouth, the paper, and even over the radio. Now, from this time forward, the story would take many twists and turns and become the subject of local legend and be spread around. And in addition, because of this story being spread around like it was, you had an influx of people wanting to see the creature for themselves and even reporters trying to interview people about the creature. 2 weeks later, after the initial sightings by Greg Garrett and Henry McDaniel, McDaniel would claim to have another sighting of the monster on May 6th at roughly 3 a.m. that morning. This sighting would spur a local radio station, WWKI, and their station director, Rick Rainbow. And you might be thinking, yes, that is actually his name. His name is actually Rick Rainbow. Which, again, this sighting, the second sighting by McDaniel on May 6th, would spur Rick Rainbow and some other members of this local radio station to try to investigate this monster and the sighting from McDaniel themselves, and they would become very involved with this story pretty much from the get-go when it was reported. Now, when Rainbow and his small search party would claim to have a sighting of the creature themselves, which they observed from afar and described it as slightly bent over, gray in color, and roughly 5 feet tall. Rick Rainbow and his search party would claim to get a recording of the cries that this monster made during their sighting before they ultimately shot at the creature and scared it off. Now, these continued sightings by people continue to drive up the media attention of this story and caused a mass influx of strangers and so-called monster hunters into town at all hours of the day, most of them heavily armed, running around the woods in the middle of the night trying to get into trouble with this monster. But of course, that poses more issues than anything else, and this situation started to get out of hand, and the local sheriff's office had to maintain order. White County Sheriff Roy Pochard Jr. did not believe in the monster's sightings. If anything, he was skeptical at best, and Pochard stated that many within the community were not afraid of the stories of the Enfield Monster, but rather the sheer amount of out-of-towners that were coming into town in the middle of the night. Sheriff Pochard would state, and I quote, "People around here are afraid to let their kids out at night, and not because of the monster. It's because they're afraid kids will get shot. There isn't any monster." Now, this influx of monster hunters would come to a head when White County Sheriff's Department would arrest 5 so-called monster hunters who were all carrying weapons who had started shooting at what they thought was a gray-colored creature in the woods, when, judging from what I was able to find in my research, seemed like it was more like a drinking escapade rather than a monster hunt. Regardless, the story and situation continued to escalate, so much so that Henry McDaniel, who was still making regular radio appearances and spreading stories about the tale, was threatened by Sheriff Pochard to stop telling the story and spreading misinformation about the story, or McDaniel would be arrested. Now, of course, I do not know the full legality behind something like that, but it goes to show you the sheer amount of panic that even the Sheriff's Department had of not really of a monster that could pose threat to a public, but rather than the actions of words being used as a type of campaign to attract out-of-towners trying to hunt this monster that could ultimately pose a serious risk to the public. After all, a bunch of people out in the woods with guns shooting at anything that moved would be extremely dangerous. Now, as this story was making rounds within the public eye, it would not take long for it to enter the eye of the space of professionals within cryptozoology. Enter Loren Coleman, infamous cryptozoologist who traveled to Enfield, Illinois to explore the story and sightings for himself. He would interview witnesses and listen to the sound recording captured by Rick Rainbow and his small posse of radio station employees. The following is a quote by Loren Coleman. I traveled to Enfield, interviewed the witnesses, looked at the sighting of the house the Enfield monster had damaged, heard some strange screeching banshee-like sounds, and walked away bewildered. Coleman would later detail his investigation into the Enfield monster in a 1974 edition of Fate magazine in conjunction with another writer named Jerome Clark. The title of the article featuring the Enfield monster was aptly titled Swamp Slobs Invade Illinois, which I feel is very fitting. Coleman would even discuss in this article that he would discuss the sighting with John Keel, who, of course, we got to know his contributions to the cryptid and UFO fields back during our Mothman series very well. John Keel, if you're not familiar, of course, being the author of the Mothman Prophecies. However, as much as the story generated significant traction within the town of Enfield and the surrounding areas, as late April and May turned into June, July, and August, the buzz from the story faded, and with it, questions still remained. What was it that McDaniel, Greg Garrett, and others saw stalking the fields and woods of Enfield, Illinois? It might be hard to fully tell, but we do have quite a few theories to discuss about what the monster could truly be. Now, the first theory, and perhaps one of the most popular, is that this entire story is a hoax, and it is made up. And that if that is the case, of course, that would be very unfortunate, but there is some evidence, some physical and some more circumstantial, as to why this story could be made up. Now, in one source that I found, it stated that the story from the child, Greg Garrett, was made up, and was made up by Greg Garrett post the first sighting by Henry McDaniel. The reason for this is because, according to Greg Garrett, Mr. McDaniel was a little bit of an eccentric, and thus Greg Garrett made the story up to tease Mr. M, as Garrett had called him, and an out-of-town newsman who came into town to cover the monster stories. Now, Greg Garrett would tell this to a group of Western Illinois University researchers who would later publish a collection of works titled A Critical Examination of the Social Contagion Image of Collective Behavior, The Case of the Enfield Monster. Within this article, their theory is that the Enfield Monster is not a monster or being from outer space, but rather a hoax fabricated through numerous layers of exaggeration and embellishment. Through their research, they were only able to find 3 first-hand accounts of actual sightings, and the rest being heavily influenced by social contagion, as they called it. Now, as quote-unquote monster fever swept the area, townsfolk began to talk about normal rustling in the leaves or noises in the night as evidence of the monster, when in fact, it could have been anything. Now, to add on to this, McDaniel was heavily involved with this story from the very get-go. Now, I am not insinuating that the entire story was made up from the get-go, while it could have been. McDaniel could have saw something very strange that night, whether it be a misidentified animal or perhaps an exotic pet, that we'll get into here in just a second as a theory, but McDaniel saw something, claimed it was a monster, and when the story caught on, he ran with it. Front pages of newspapers, radio interviews, bigwig cryptozoologists investigating, Is very well that McDaniel got his share of his 15 minutes of fame. Now, the next theory to propose is that, again, we just talked about the hoax theory, is the exotic pet theory. And this theory states, and that is proposed, that what McDaniel saw, and maybe others saw, was an escaped pet, such as a kangaroo or ape or something like that. Now, while the rural Midwest has had sightings of Bigfoot before, kind of unrelated, but kind of piggybacking on the ape theory, I am hard-pressed to think that this could be an ape. If McDaniel was truly only a few feet away from this creature when he saw it, I would be hard-pressed to think that someone could have mistake a ape, like a chimp, for example, as some type of gray monster with pink eyes and 2 arms and 3 feet. I can't see the possibility that something could be misinterpreted for something like that. And I would be, again, very hard-pressed to think that somebody could mistake a chimp for something like that. However, another instance, or another animal that is proposed, is the idea that this could have been a kangaroo. And this idea has a little bit more merit, and let me explain why. Now, kangaroos, the height fits. They stand at roughly about 5 feet tall. They are often hunched over. They have 2 arms right about chest height, and have a tail that often drags along the ground, giving the illusion that it could have 3 legs. A man named Alan Yorkshire would contact Enfield police, stating that he lost a kangaroo that was his pet in Ohio that had escaped a year prior, and from hearing the stories, thought that it could have been his kangaroo that people were seeing and not some monster. However, McDaniel would later claim that a kangaroo was not even close to what he saw, and even stated that during his time in the army and being stationed in Australia, that he had a pet kangaroo and was very familiar with them, making the overall kangaroo theory a little bit doubtful. Now, another theory I want to propose here is the alien theory. Now, McDaniel himself thought that the creature he saw was some type of alien being. Now, that would be on trend with the US's overall attitude towards aliens during the 70s, but unfortunately there is no way to prove whether or not this thing was an alien other than its extremely strange appearance. Now, the creature's overall appearance does slightly give me squonk vibes if you are very familiar with the squonk. If you're not familiar with the squonk, I don't know if I've actually covered it in our cryptids, not our cryptids across America, our fearsome critters collection. Now, the squonk is probably one of the more popular fearsome critters. So popular I could probably do an episode just on the squonk. But it is this very kind of small, gray, wrinkly, slimy thing that is very gross and very strange. And his appearance is so ugly, it is rumored that the squonk cries incessantly all the time because he is so upset with his own appearance and thinks he's ugly. Now, obviously, that doesn't seem to be the case in the story of the Enfield Monster. However, there are a little bit of similarities in the overall appearance. However, whether or not you think the squonk or the Enfield Monster is an alien, I'm not quite sure. But again, there's really no evidence to support the alien theory. Henry McDaniel seems very convinced that he thought this creature was some type of alien being that was not from this planet. But again, there's not really any evidence to prove that. You don't really have any other sightings of supposed aliens that look anything remotely close to this. I'm instantly trying to think in my brain of kind of very some rural alien encounters. You know, you have the Flatwoods Monster, which is widely regarded to be an alien being, according to some theories, depending on what you believe. You have the Kelly Hopkinsville Goblins case, which again, those are rumored to be aliens, not quite sure, depending on what theory you subscribe to there. But those are 2 theories. Those also take right in the heartland of America, Flatwoods being West Virginia, the Flatwoods Monster being in West Virginia, and the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter being in Tennessee, I believe. I could be getting this wrong, but I believe I'm right. But you have sightings like those that kind of toe the line of whether this is cryptid or whether this is alien. You could even rope in the Dover Demon there, which, again, very well could be an alien, depending on what theory you want to believe. In any of those cases, those are beings that I would say share more alien characteristics as opposed to what is described by Henry McDaniel with the Enfield Monster. There's really no similarities, and there's no evidence to support the idea that the Enfield Monster is an alien, and there's nothing really about it that screams alien to me. This seems like it's just some kind of weird creature monstrosity, and that's kind of what we're left with. There doesn't really seem to be anything that would be indicative of some type of alien being, but maybe that's just my own personal thoughts. Now, my own personal theory when it comes to the Enfield Monster is honestly maybe a lame one in the grand scheme of everything. And it is lame because I honestly think that this story was made up. Now, let me explain why I think that way. It seemed, from what I was able to find online and through everything that I've researched, it seemed like Henry McDaniel was a little bit eccentric and a little bit on the strange side, and that he was definitely into this kind of thing, whether it be aliens or monsters and everything of the like. But you have to take into account that this whole story seems to revolve around Henry McDaniel. He seems to be the focal point of everything. He had the first encounter, then you had Greg Garrett come forward and say, hey, I had a sighting 30 minutes earlier. Oh, wait, nope, sorry, I made that up, to mess with Henry McDaniel. You have Henry McDaniel going on the radio, talking with Rick Rainbow at WWKI, saying that he had a sighting of this creature, and then he would call the station again 2 weeks later, saying he saw it again. This again would now spur Rick Rainbow and his team from the radio station to claim to see a creature. And this whole story starts and ends with Henry McDaniel, and that makes me incredibly skeptical. Of course, we've talked about sightings on this show, or maybe cryptid encounters, or whatever it may be, UFO cases, where the stories are instantly more credible when you have people of all walks of life saying that they're reporting something, saying that they're seeing something, saying that, they are absolutely confused and baffled about what they're witnessing. You have so many different people coming forward, maybe with all different opinions, different backgrounds, whatever it may be. You have a lot of different sets of eyes saying they've seen something. Whereas in the case of the Enfield Monster, and in the case of Henry McDaniel, this story seems to start and end with him. Seems like, again, like I just mentioned, story started with him, he perpetuated the story, and clearly from what I was able to find in my research, it got to the point so bad where the sheriff threatened legal action and to arrest him if he did not stop talking about the creature, because obviously this caused quite a stir within the local community, so much so that it was causing issues with people coming into town with loaded weapons, trying to be monster hunters in the middle of the night. And of course, you just can't have a group of 5 to 10 or even a dozen people going out in the woods in the middle of the night and just shooting random guns. It's a very dangerous predicament, and I can understand why the sheriff's department would want to put a stop to that. But again, this story kind of begins and ends with Henry McDaniel. And while I don't know for certain that Henry McDaniel was eccentric or strange, while I don't know that personally, it seems through my research that was what I was able to find. And I have a sinking feeling that maybe McDaniel did see something that night. Maybe he saw a bobcat, maybe he saw a kangaroo and misidentified it. Or maybe just flat out made this whole story up. I think it is really hard to tell overall what the origin of this story was. But I just have a really hard time believing the story in general. But I certainly believe the social contagion theory, like the Western Illinois University researchers proposed. I definitely think that had a big play in here, a big part of this overall story. And it caused everyone to take this story and ran with it. And to top it all off, this story, once it took off, people got monster fever. This was in a rural area. People started chatting. People started spreading rumors. That's kind of how small town areas work. Everybody knows each other. And the second a story gets started, the second the rumor mill starts going, there's no stopping it. And I think that this is exactly what happened here. And then again, people started affiliating little rustling of the bushes, little things that went bump in the middle of the night as some type of monster, when there's just no evidence to prove that. And I think because of this, because of Henry McDaniel claiming to have this sighting, whether he saw something or whether he made it up, and then people taking the story, wanting to believe in something, wanting maybe to believe that Enfield did have a monster, took this story, ran with it, and thus a legend was born. Now again, I often say on the show that I take the side of the skeptic, more likely than not, because I like to see hard evidence and proof of something existing. Sometimes I break that mold a little bit with kind of generally how I'm feeling, maybe while I'm recording the show. But I am taking the side of the skeptic yet again on this episode. There's just not really a whole lot of evidence here. Of course, Lauren Coleman went and investigated this, but I couldn't really find his overall attitude towards the sighting. I couldn't find out whether or not he believed the Enfield Monster was real, or whether, he collected this evidence, but he couldn't really figure out what it was, and he was bewildered. That was his word. I could never find really whether or not he thought that this creature was tangible, or what the case may be. I was never able to find that out. So overall, I guess that maybe puts a little doubt in my head, I guess. But unfortunately, again, I think the Enfield Monster is made up. Again, I love monster stories. I love cryptid cases. They're very fun to explore, and I love the idea of kind of, again, a monster stalking the woods of small-town America. I love the idea of that. However, again, I need there to be some evidence of it, and I just feel like the entire Enfield Monster case is severely lacking evidence and contains a whole lot of he said, she said, I saw something, and there's nobody else to back it up, and I saw something in the woods that was bent over and 5 feet tall. It's like that doesn't mean it was a monster with 3 legs and claws and pink eyes. That's not what that means. So again, I'm taking the side of the skeptic, and I ultimately think that this case was made up. Whether it was inspired by an actual sighting of something in the night by Henry McDaniel, I'm not quite sure, but I think most of the story was fabricated. And again, not the best way to end an episode, I guess, but that is just my personal thoughts. But with that being said, that is going to do it for me on this week's episode of Unblurring the Unknown over the Enfield Monster. I hope you all greatly appreciated it. And again, I will go back and say, if you were listening to this show on YouTube or Spotify, please feel free to follow me there. Like, comment, subscribe. Helps me out greatly. Follow me on Instagram and TikTok. Same handle, Unblurring the Unknown. Again, I appreciate the support. It means worlds to me. And again, I cannot say thank you enough. But with that being said, again, this is going to do it for me on this week's episode of Unblurring the Unknown. And I will see you all on the next one.